Chapter 7. That's a pretty big house. Jasmine hadn't been sure what to expect when she skipped a day at school to come to the address Jason had given her. She had no idea what sort of place housed a family of superpowered human beings. Would they live in some sort of futuristic place that was hidden with cloaking devices? Or maybe in some old rundown shack that was a front for an uber-advanced facility where they trained and ran loose? Either way, she hadn't expected the place to look so normal and yet so out of place at the same time. It hadn't taken her long to find it. U.S. Route 183 led straight up from the lake through Heford and Holdridge, and the address was easy to find since it was just to the west of the main road. Heford was just south of Holdridge, Nebraska, so they were practically out in the middle of nowhere compared to her suburban Ohio upbringing, the place she'd fled once she'd realized that the smaller community of Heford existed way out here. Caught dead center between Holdridge to the north and the Harlan County Lake to the south, which was close to the border between Nebraska and Kansas, it was about 10 miles in either direction till one ran into something other than big fields of farmland. It had been really easy to spot the house since it was so large. It was the opposite of what Jasmine had expected, normal in almost every other way except for its size. It stuck out like a sore thumb, telling her she was in the right place. The mansion sat at the end of a long driveway which jutted off from the road. She had driven south on US 183, turned right onto a smaller road, then turned right again onto the dirt and gravel driveway. The driveway led right across the front of the house, then tapered off into a smaller path that circled around back. A makeshift turnaround had been laid down in front of the house using gravel, clearly well used by the residents. The house itself was free of most forms of vegetation. Except for a few bushes that lined the front of the house on either side of the porch, and a garden that Jasmine suspected was only occasionally kept, there were no trees or any other form of shrubbery. The only landmark in the area was the house, with big empty fields on all four sides. The house itself was colored with a combination of various faded shades of blue and gray. It had clearly been here for a number of years, standing out as a solid three-dimensional pond amid a sea of brown and tan. It was longer than it was tall, and from where she was standing, she could tell that a significant portion of the back had been added on after the initial construction. It looked newer, and the paint was fresher than the rest of the building. In fact, if she listened carefully enough, she was sure she heard some sort of circular saw being used out back somewhere. Just to the right of the house, connected to the driveway with a much wider gravel path, was an old rusty brown shed. Jasmine saw that much of that shed had also been rebuilt, but in a piecemeal fashion. It was smaller than the house, but not by much, and every entrance or window was sealed up tight. Beside the shed was a big black pickup truck. Not too shiny or new, but new enough that it had been bought recently, or at least maintained very, very well. She stood there, gawking at the tall three-story mansion. It didn't look like any of the houses around any place she'd ever lived, and she was a bit intimidated by the sheer immensity of it. The slight sense of being overwhelmed shook her up a little, reminding her of how she had felt the night she had torn her room apart with Jenny standing just outside the door. The house was too big for her to handle, just like her problems. All of these things made Jasmine feel quite out of place, like a cat sneaking onto someone else's property without permission from her owner or the owner of the house. Like a cat, she felt the urge to scatter at the first sign of someone else's presence, but then she remembered the look in Jason's eyes as he had shown her what he could do. He wasn't afraid of his power. He was in full control of it, or at least some control of it. He knew his limits, anyway, what he could and couldn't do. Jasmine envied him, and she was more curious than ever about what kind of people lived in such a normal place. It wasn't at all what she'd thought she'd find when she got into her car to come here. Maybe the people inside weren't as strange as she feared either. She walked up to the front door, hesitant. Was this the kind of family who brought people in through the front door or the back door? Which was more appropriate? Well, the front door faces the street, so that's as good as any place, probably. She stepped onto the stone porch, also well kept. It made Jasmine wonder how exactly these people got the money for a place like this. It wasn't a shining celebrity mansion for sure, but it still required money to keep a place like this going. She knocked on the door a moment before it hit her. Did these people use their power for personal gain? Had she stumbled upon some secret cabal of supervillains waiting for her so that they could use her power to help them take over the world? She immediately regretted knocking. Maybe she could just dive into the bushes beside the porch, if she could get up the nerve to move that fast and that suddenly. Too late. The lock on the door clicked and the knob turned, the door swinging open. Jasmine was looking into the face of an older woman. She appeared to be on the tail end of middle-aged, yet somehow more youthful than her true age would suggest. Only slightly taller than Jasmine herself, her short black hair was pierced by soft streaks of gray, and the dark brown eyes combined with that to give an overall appearance of trustworthiness, acceptance, and age-filled wisdom. She wasn't a monster. She was just normal. A normal lady. She opened her mouth to speak, and to Jasmine's fading surprise, her voice sounded pretty normal as well. "Well, hello there." She sounded very young, which seemed to pull even more years away from the fit, feminine frame. The smile did likewise, showing plenty of laugh lines but lighting up the eyes. She was dressed in jeans and a fashionable sweatshirt t-shirt combination. Jasmine was instantly glad she had met this woman at the door instead of a male greeter like Jason, or some other superhuman she might have dreamt up on her way here. "What can I do for you, miss?" the woman inquired politely. Jasmine must have been staring wide-eyed and catatonic, because the woman smiled and leaned against the door. Jasmine was glad it was still mostly warm outside, because she would have felt terrible for making this nice lady stand in the cold just for her. "It's all right. Don't be afraid," the woman said understandingly. "What's your name?" Jasmine felt her hands playing with her coat buttons as she forced sound from her throat. My name's Jasmine Corso. I met someone yesterday named Jason. He gave me this address." "Oh, Jasmine!" the woman exclaimed, as if she had known that name for years and had been waiting to put a face to it. "Yes, I remember that name. Come on in." Jasmine, against her better judgment, stepped into the strange house as the woman moved out of the way. "It's wonderful to meet you," the woman said, shaking her hand as she walked inside. Jasmine held her breath and shook the woman's hand, glancing around nervously at the inside of the big house. They were in some sort of foyer, which didn't appear to be extravagantly decorated. There was no gaudy art hanging from the walls, but there were some faux flowers on a few stands. The foyer was essentially a long hallway that ended in a staircase leading up, and two doorways on each wall that led to other parts of the house. The floor was a simple tile floor, and there was a piece of carpet set against one corner beneath an overflowing coat rack. On this carpet was a basket full of shoes. Jasmine started to take off her shoes, but the woman stopped her. "Oh, don't worry about that, honey. You're fine. I just want to make sure you're comfortable. Come on in here." Jasmine followed her halfway down the hall, moving through the first doorway on the left. There was no door on it. The new paint on the specific spots suggested there once had been, but that it had been removed for easier access. And so Jasmine walked right through and stepped onto the brown shag carpet. The room had a large window that showed much of the side yard on the far wall, and also a normal-sized window to the left, through which Jasmine could see her car sitting in the turnaround out front. The woman told her she could sit anywhere, and Jasmine chose a seat on one of the two couches around the room. "My name is Mary Ann Dixon," the woman told her very hospitably, standing in front of her. "I'm Atlas's wife, and Jason's sometimes mother. Can I get you anything to drink?" Jasmine shook her head, putting her hands in her lap. She was still really nervous and didn't want to be left in this room by herself. "Okay," Mary Ann replied, finding her own seat across from Jasmine in a big plushy armchair. "So, what can I do for you today, Jasmine?" Jasmine took in a deep breath and sighed. How on earth was she supposed to explain why she was here without going into too much detail? But she reminded herself that this is why they invited her here. Mary Ann reminded her of her own mother in so many ways, even in just the short interaction from the door to the living room. Her own mother was so hospitable and welcomed any and all guests into her home, and Mary Ann was no different. To Jasmine's relief, Mary Ann saw how uneasy Jasmine was and started for her. I see that you are not completely comfortable being here, so maybe I can help by asking some questions to get us started, she suggested. You have a gift? Like Jason and the rest of us? Jasmine nodded. Mary Ann gave her another one of those comforting smiles, and her reaction was not at all what Jasmine had imagined. That's really wonderful, Jasmine, she told her. I know you're not used to thinking about it this way, but we feel so blessed to have our gifts. I'm very happy that you stopped by. Do you know what your power is? Jasmine hesitated. For a long moment, she thought, then realized with a start that she had no idea what she could actually do. Well, actually, I really don't know what to call it, she confessed. Things around me, they move and fly, and sometimes smack into other stuff. Mary Ann was about to say something, probably something very positive, but Jasmine felt her frustration come to the surface. It's only ever made me miserable, she blurted out. I wish I didn't have it, or that I could at least do something about not being in control of it. Mary Ann smiled, another understanding gleam peering through some sadness in her eyes. Jasmine didn't really know what to make of that look until Mary Ann started speaking again. You know, Atlas and I, we're not able to have children of our own, she said with a sigh. Her shoulders sagged, and Jasmine saw the cheerful personality briefly crack, revealing some begrudging realism. The older woman stood up and walked over to the large window on the far wall, staring out of it as if she was looking into the past. We both agreed that it was for the best, Mary Ann continued. We never knew what would happen if we had a child, with our gifts, you know. And we decided not to adopt. I wanted to at first, but his reasoning went something like, it wouldn't be fair to the child or children to be raised in a home by two superpowered parents. I eventually decided he was right. I can teleport and withstand any temperature, and he's never been sick a day in his life and can turn into any material. What kind of household would we be for a child? And we didn't want social services poking around this place anyway. Atlas especially was afraid that they'd find our underground bunkers. Jasmine's heart lodged in her throat. Your underground bunkers? Mary Ann turned and smiled, sitting down on the couch. Yes, Atlas's parents and mine were very well off. His father was a doctor, and my parents were both in the military, so we were left with quite a large sum of money when they passed away, along with this big house out in the middle of nowhere. But that's another story for another time. My point is that I have always viewed my abilities as something that stood in the way of what I really wanted to do and who I wanted to be. I wished I never had them so that I could have a normal life, a normal husband, children, a family. That's what I want, to be normal, Jasmine exclaimed, relieved that someone other than her was going through this. But Mary Ann was quick to respond. But that's not the life I've been given, she said firmly. Jasmine was caught off guard by the resolve in her voice. And if I hadn't ever found these powers, I would never have met Atlas, or Jason, or Candace, or Chuck, or you and the rest of the people who have come to call this place home. Jasmine held her tongue. She wanted to shout out and reject what Mary Ann was saying, but in her heart she knew Mary Ann was right. Instead, she decided to follow the train of thought that Mary Ann had given her, even though it frustrated her because she was skeptical about finding any answers. So, then, I guess I'm wondering, what are these powers for? Why do we have them? What are we supposed to do with them? Mary Ann shrugged quickly, and Jasmine would have objected if she hadn't seen the optimism return in Mary Ann's eyes and in her bright smile. Whatever we are meant to do, that time isn't here yet. At least I don't believe it is, she told her. But my bigger question, if I were you, would be to find out what exactly my powers are and how I can use them. Jasmine's mind pondered Mary Ann's words, and she found that even with all the discomfort and anxiety she felt, she was also very curious. She was beginning to feel a little safer as well. Everyone here had their own secrets, which turned out not to be secrets among their close-knit family, so she didn't feel as out of place as she usually did. She certainly didn't feel as terrible as she had for the past few days, moping around her torn-up dorm room. Her excuse for how the hole had been torn in the ceiling sounded flimsy to her, no matter how well the maintenance staff had bought it. What if she stayed here instead? But she would have to think about it first, and she had only met 2 of the people from here, Jason and now Mary Ann, and so she didn't know if she had an appropriate image of the whole group. "Miss Mary?" came a soft voice from the hallway. Jasmine jumped a little at the new sound, but when she saw the small frame inching around the corner into the room, she could tell that the newcomer was just as nervous of her as Jasmine was of the new face. The thin, sandy blonde-haired girl's bright green eyes settled on Jasmine. In form, she reminded Jasmine of Jenny, but with a completely different, opposite personality. Jasmine didn't even have to ask or observe for too long to see that this young woman was seriously introverted. "Come on in, Candace," Mary Ann beckoned. "Jasmine, this is Candace. She's in charge of telling us where to find people with special abilities. She never forgets a face, and she's the one who helped us to find you." Candace hurried over and nervously offered Jasmine her hand. Jasmine hesitated to take it, and when she finally decided to reach out to it, Candace pulled it back to her side preemptively, then thrust it out again awkwardly. "Oh, sorry. Sorry." Her voice was like a speaking mouse, except not quite as high-pitched. She stared at Jasmine with what Jasmine thought might be a mixture of awe, shock, terror, and admiration, give or take the terror. Jasmine suddenly felt extremely self-conscious and glanced over to see how Mary Ann would react to the reaction. "Well, Candace, what do you see?" Candace swallowed, took a deep breath to compose herself, then folded her hands dutifully in front of her and spoke very professionally. "She's very, very powerful." Jasmine was confused. "Wait, how do you know?" Candace smiled, a genuine, inviting smile that was just as soft as her voice, and Mary Ann came to stand between the 2 girls, putting her hands on their shoulders. "Candace, how about you explain all of that to Jasmine while you give her a tour of the property? Jasmine, would that be all right with you?" Jasmine looked once more at Candace's inviting smile, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess that would be fine. Lead away."